welcome Tooba Durraze and Brad Queener. I believe you're no strangers.
Hey, Julia, how are you?
Hey.
Hey, Tooba, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Well, thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Tooba. I'm the CEO and founder of Me by AI, also a geek by nature, by training. Super excited to be here talking to Brett. Let me pass it over to Brett to give a quick introduction to himself. So, Brett, over to you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Brett Queener. I'm a partner at Bonfire Ventures. Uh, we've got about $1 billion under management. We invest in seed stage software companies, B2B, primarily at the application layer. But part of this conversation might be, what is the application layer anymore? Been here about 6 years prior to Bonfire. I'm old as dirt, 25 years at software companies. Worked the two fastest growing software companies of their era, a company called Siebel Systems, and then spent 11 and a half years at Salesforce, where I built go-to-market, ran operations, and ran all of product. Um, and then I was co-founder and COO of a company called Smart Recruiters, probably the hardest space any founder could go into, selling recruiting technology, but that company is north of $100 million in revenue and on its way.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. I kind of want to dive into your thesis today, the change economy thesis. So, first and foremost, for everyone who hasn't read that, find a link, subscribe to Brett's Substack. It's great writing. I would definitely read that. But let's think about how you've written about how we're no longer in a knowledge economy, but a change economy. And you talk about basically where the pace of innovation isn't fast, but it's sort of compounding on top of each other. So, for everyone else who hasn't read it, can you just quickly walk us through your thesis? And then I think one question I have is specifically around what do you think fundamentally shifts when change becomes the default operating condition of the company?
Absolutely. And thank you, Tuba, for doing this. I write, it's a little bit long form. It's primarily for founders. It's on my Substack. It's not for PR. I primarily write to name my anxiety. When I'm meeting with companies and I'm observing what's going on and I can't name it, I write to name the anxiety. It's my therapy. Um, and we've always said in technology, hey, go fast, ship fast, go hard. Okay, that's great. We all should go hard and fast. Um, but I've been in software for 25 years. And for time immemorial, the way in which we've run those companies is with the assumption that market impacting substantive product innovation happens probably once a year.
Mhm.
You know, if you think about it, there's a Dreamforce, whatever, there's a HubSpot Force, there's an Outreach World, like once a year, the big announcement,
Yeah.
and sometimes twice a year. But AI, and specifically in two situations: one, the pace at which you can build;
Mhm.
two, how many less screens you have to build that no users were going to use anyways have to be built, changes
Mhm.
all of that. So your products can and likely have to be significantly more impactful, I would say at least each month. And so in
Mhm.
my mind, the change economy is really like, when I think about the next era's winners, are the
Yeah.
ones that can rethink sort of the tried and true traditional SaaS playbook into one that works for this new reality. And it's kind of exciting because, like, when we work at Salesforce, no one sold software as a service. You would never sell software direct to every segment of the market. And there
Mhm.
was no playbook, there were no blogs to read, there were no conferences to attend. So we had to kind of make this shit up. And I'm watching this happen right now. And that's really what the change economy is about.
No, that's great. And I think one of the questions I have is from the outside, it appears, okay, there's a lot of iteration and change happening, but sometimes we know the actual product and engineering teams fall a little bit behind the marketing schedule per se. How do you think the product and engineering teams now need to rethink their development in order to keep pace, especially when feedback loops are like so much shorter now, but the stakes are higher in terms of if you're not delivering a lot of product fast, you're no longer
Sure.
relevant.
Well, I think what's interesting, you made a comment there, like falling behind market. And it's always been kind of the case. Marketing wants this, sales wants this, what's going on, product team. I think we have to think about it. It kind of starts with product and engineering first. The
Mhm.
really interesting thing about this agentic world, and a lot of writings on that over the last year, which is really exciting because you actually have product that's useful,
Mhm.
actually help somebody do their job. I think it starts first and foremost with product and engineering. Now, I think what is interesting is what I'm seeing in product and engineering organizations for those that are kind of at the AI native pace. And look,
Mhm.
if you're a larger corporation with a large monolithic code base, we understand you can't go on lovable.dev and just roll out code, right? And you sell to the enterprise, there's a transition. And so for me, it all starts with product.
Mhm.
Um, because in my mind, you either have an agentic product that sort of immediately wows a prospect about a better way for their jobs to be done, or you don't. That's sort of the baseline.
Mhm.
And so within that, what's really interesting is I think what I'm seeing is product in dev and success orgs, even early out of the gate, we'd be like, okay, here's your product org, here's your dev org. Okay, how does dev do QA? Okay, and then there's a support org that kind of lives in dev, and then you move it out to success. They're all kind of becoming munged
Mhm.
into sort of one collaborative collective being. What is really interesting and exciting was the hardest thing in running startups in my past was as you got larger, the devs got farther abstracted away from the customer problem.
Yeah.
And it was very hard to keep them motivated and around the impact, where that is not the case of what I'm seeing these orgs. And so I think within this, there's a couple things we have to think about. One, the biggest change is we have to take the definition of done. When I
Mhm.
started in software, there was waterfall, and then we got to agile. And then
Yeah.
we can talk about MVP, or Amazon talked about minimum lovable product. Done is not I delivered a feature as scoped and designed that met some quality test.
Mhm.
Done is does your product deliver on the promise of the job to be done that your customer expects for you to do for them? Either in an assistant, co-pilot assistant manner, it's helping a human being, or independently, like something replaces workflow. Uh,
Mhm.
I also think that we have to define where scarcity lives now.
Yeah.
Historically, the way we've run teams is that scarcity was tech talent, dev talent.
Yeah.
So we wanted to make sure that product spent all their time getting the stuff right. We used Jira to do t-shirt sizing and allocations and the rest of it.
Yeah.
That's not the scarcity now.
Mhm.
The scarcity is the ability of the combined organization to quickly out-iterate the competition in delivering these jobs to be done or delivering more jobs. That's it. That's your scarcity. Can these as a collective unit
Yeah.
out-deliver in an iterative way
Yeah.
the competition? So that's kind of how I think about it. I mean, do you want to maybe some follow-up questions there? Because you know me, as I
Yeah.
warned you,
I have one that's sticking to my
I can go on for hours.
I have one that's on based on what you said, there's something that stuck out to me, which is the definition of done has changed. I'm wondering, in your experience, has the expectation of what the definition of done is, has that changed for the other side, for the customers, especially enterprise customers? Do you find more enterprise customers and companies now being okay with less refined, less fully baked products?
I have seen that. I think this is a phase.
Yeah.
I think a lot of companies, and Mark just went on about how is he invest in some of the AI companies and figure out if this is VIB revenue or et cetera. I think in the period of the last year, a lot of people have been exploring AI, and the
Yeah.
models are changing so quickly that to some extent, I have seen customers sort of engaging,
Hmm.
no way, don't fix it in the field, and sort of giving feedback, et cetera. Now, um, I think that will change. Here's what I think about.
Yeah.
There is a new relationship between the customer and a software provider, which is
Hmm.
the promise in these agentic products are, I'm going to significantly help you do your job. I'm not delivering you a CRUD database with workflows and screens that you go in and enter, and then you go out and do your job elsewhere. I'm
Yeah.
going to help you do your job. either as an assistant or I'm going to take parts of your work away. Given that promise, I think customers are much more willing to be engaged in very specific feedback. And what is very interesting is, for years we'd be like, well, don't build exactly what the customer asks for because they're shitty product managers. What we're seeing is they're bad at understanding screens and the rest of it. But if customer says, this is my pain, can you take this pain away? Then they're actually much better product input managers than they were in the past. And I think it's really interesting to understand. Now, what I will say, though, is weird is, yes, you can ship very quick. You and I talked about this. Like, how do you not just produce a bunch of crap? I actually think the QA bar is higher. I think the done bar is higher for two reasons. One is you're not releasing a bunch of stuff and there's some field or some object that works in some screen that somebody goes to and they kind of go, oh, that didn't work. And then you buy a session replay and then you can track it and then prioritize it as P0, P1, P2. In like an agentic assistant, the way I think about it is, I always tell my software companies when they think about AI is, assume somebody was hiring the smartest person they could ever hire, who worked at the speed of 10 people, who knew everything about your company, and never went on Glassdoor and complained about your shitty management. That's what your product's like. Now, imagine you hired that person, and one day they came to work and they just started glitching. You would kind of notice that very, very quickly. And so I actually think while you can ship faster, it doesn't mean you should just ship faster. It means you should ship impactful product much faster than you have in the past. And so you and I had this conversation about Cursor.
Yep.
Right? Is it a technology breakthrough or is it a taste UX breakthrough? And you pretty quickly said it's a taste UX breakthrough.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think just because you can ship faster, the bar is actually higher. So
yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like there are a lot of fundamentals that are shifting back to like how things used to be, in the sense that impact is more front and center versus like flashy features. There's a concept that you talk about in your thesis, which I thought was really interesting, around everboarding, meaning the relationship between the software provider and the customer being a little bit more relational than even it used to be. So I'm curious about you kind of elaborating on that. And what does it look like? Describe it, and then what does it look like how if it's done well? Because I know we have this fear of like having like account folks always be constantly attached to customers as well.
It's interesting. These are two organizations and software companies that are often seen as, I guess I have to invest there. And for those people who have tried to sell into these functions, they're doing God's work, but they never have power to buy anything.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's onboarding, there's everboarding, there's waterboarding. I'll talk about onboarding versus everboarding.
Yeah.
Sales onboarding is a very interesting thing. I remember when I joined Salesforce.com, I was getting sued by Tom Siebel because he liked to sue people. And we'd hired like 30 reps over the year and they'd never been trained. And Mark was like, hey, can you think you can train these people? Because we got to go kick Siebel's ass. And I was like, have we ever done training here? No. So I put together like a 1-week boot camp with a certification and case study. And if you didn't pass the certification, you were fired. Like it was, you know. But the funny thing is, when we think about sales onboarding, we focus on the first 60 to 90 days of a sales hire. We got to get them the ramped. We got to get competent running our playbook, know exactly what to say or do at each stage of the sales process. But what's interesting is if your product, by the end of that first year, is 2 to 3 times more different or more valuable than of their tenure than it was the knowledge you shared in the first 30 to 60 days, what then? Right? And so when I talk to AI founders, you know, I ask them, how much do you think your sales approach, especially relates to your messaging, your discovering your value or capability? You know, in my messaging tree, what does your product, what job to be done does your product do for your buyer that they really should about, that they want to solve now better than somebody else, right? If you can nail that, that's the basics of product marketing and sales messaging. How much do you think that's going to change over the next 12 months? And they look at me like, well, a ton. And then I'm like, well, then what are you doing to make sure that your team is on board? And then similarly, customer onboarding, another often seen as a junior function. I always thought it was silly in a SaaS world where products were always customizable, released a lot of features, et cetera, that we thought about onboarding, like, let's get them live.
Yeah.
And then they were like, oh, we'll get some success person, the function that we underinvest in, and somehow they're going to magically make the customer take advantage of all the ongoing stuff. It was always silly. Now, if you deploy a product and your product becomes 2 to 3 times more capable over a year, then what? How do you think about that person or that using that product, discovering that capability, et cetera? Because you and I talked about this, like there's an R in ARR. Well, we'll talk about annual in a second, but ARR is annual recurring revenue. We look at churn and NRR, et cetera. But like if you have an employee, people would evaluate, I'm using this agentic product, or I could hire an employee. And I'd be like, how much growth has this employee shown over the year? How much potential do they have vis-a-vis other people? And I think they'll think that same way around products. And so how do you think through this? The other thing which is really interesting is, I remember I'm a crazy zero inbox guy. And I remember I was like the 7th customer Superhuman. And Rahul onboarded me, the founder of Superhuman. And I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting. This seems like a waste. I was like, how can this be efficient? And what Rahul got, and it wasn't AI yet, this was a personal thing to me about a habit of how I like to manage my email. And if he could get me into that habit, then I was hooked. And it's the same thing with AI. Like I have organizations that are thinking of that have hired really expensive people from onboarding. Like somebody hired somebody from Apple who was responsible for designing that package or box that you get from Apple products. It's still really cool, even though you just get the same phone. It's just like the last phone, but has a better battery. But with that box, and when you open that, and the tape open, it's that little magic moment. I think it's the same way we have to rethink onboarding for these agentic products, because while you might be selling to an organization, these are very personal products. I am helping you as an individual do this work. And either out of the gate, they go, oh, hell yeah, right? I think you and I were talking about, I remember my wife, she went to the Kennedy School. She's a preeminent expert on charter schools and affordable housing and the rest of it. Amazing writer. And she spends a lot of time sort of the shadow government here where I live, surfacing all state data and analysis, and then putting stuff together, presenting at city council and to state representatives. And I remember the first time I showed her ChatGPT, she was kind of like, oh, this is pretty interesting. And then when I moved to Claude, and she had a project where it remembered her voice and started writing. And then I showed her deep research. She's hook, line, and sinker, right? But like there are these moments of delight. And so I think onboarding is something we have to really think about and get right. So that's how I think about everboarding versus sort of this point in time, whether it's your salespeople, your customers.
No, I think it appears that you need to stay more like top of mind for your customers in terms of like relevance. And like the minute they forget about a tool or forget about you, it's a lot of folks that just tend to move on to the next fancy thing that's coming out, right? Which brings me to
people are really busy, right?
People are really busy. People are excited to try all sorts of tools right now. So it's there's a lot of enthusiasm around like, I'm going to try everything. But the thing that sticks generally ends up being the thing that is like top of mind for them in terms of relation, messaging, all of that. Yeah? Would you agree?
I agree.
Yeah, so like that brings me to say like product marketing and messaging. There's something that you talked about, which is that messaging needs to be more context, moment, and signal aware, like all 3 things versus what it used to be before. So can you give me an example or North Star of like a company that you've seen do that well, or where have you seen that play out?
I mean, look, I've always thought that the software companies at the application layer win the best, have the best product marketing.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is across the company, it is very clear. If you pulled somebody up in a hallway, and I'll get back because you're chuckling and you smile about this, they know exactly who they're selling to. When they sell to them, they have the elevator card, they have the longer pitch, but they understand very clearly why this, why us, why now. Why should somebody look at the category of solutions you represent? Why is it important? What pain does it solve? Why us? Why do you solve that better than somebody else? And why now? Like, if you don't do this now, what costs are you going to incur? What risk are you going to incur? or what revenue will you lose, not only at a business level, but at a personal risk level.
Yep.
Companies that nail that kick ass.
Yeah.
You cannot scale a go-to-market organization without that. And a great example would be, Tooba, where did you last work?
Qualified.
Qualified.
Yes.
So Sean and Craig, who worked with me and for me at Salesforce, I mean, Craig is probably one of the best product marketers
Yep.
that I've come across in my career. They went into an existing category that already existed, Drift and others, and they came in and they out-product, I mean, Bing builds good product, don't disagree, but they out-product market the crap out of the competition. And I was just sitting there watching it going, oh my Lord, this isn't a fair fight. And right, Tuba, you would tell me, what would you do? What would Craig and team make you do every Friday at Qualified?
They would repeat the same messaging to us over and over again. So everyone who worked in the organization had this like idea of like who we are, what we do, and for whom was just ingrained in our heads. So you could have picked an engineer who was like a new hire from an engineering org and put them in front of a customer, but they would know exactly what these dimensions were to talk to a customer, which I found really interesting because I was like, it was so repetitive to me, right? But like now running my own company, I'm like, that is such a good tactic to have because you never know when folks from your company are, again, going to run into customers or potential customers. And like the same thing with product marketing as well. Like I hadn't and I don't come from Salesforce. I've obviously explored a lot at the World Economic Forum as well. But Qualified was my first example of seeing like how you could have the best product in the world, but if your messaging isn't right, and if you're not marketing it well, how flat it can fall.
Right. And then
These are lessons, yeah.
And the big issue is, okay, most companies suck at that once a year.
Yeah.
What happens when your product changes every 30 days? Like, I literally in the Slack orbs of the ones that are the fastest growing, and they've raised a lot of money, and they're on their way.
Yeah.
In friggin' chaos. Product doesn't know what dev is shipping. Customer success doesn't know that this thing is out. Marketing is trying to keep up to date. It is chaos.
Yeah.
And so you need to nail this, and you need to refresh it every month. It sounds crazy, but I almost was like, day one of the new month is a day off. We spend one day each month refreshing the team, refreshing our materials, and make sure we understand that vis-a-vis the competition. And one really good exercise for any founder in the room when you get to like, I don't know, 30, 40, 50, 100 people, and you start to build your executive team, pull your executive team around and tell them, take out a card and write down, what is it we do for whom that they give a shit about?
Yeah.
Other than somebody else. And what you will find is those answers, half of them will be bad, but they're not aligned. And then just run that experiment. I promise you'll be like, oh, okay. I get what Brett and Tuba are talking about.
Yeah, I think the worst thing you can have is sitting in a room with your C-suite and like everyone has a different answer for what you do and what you're
Well, if
addressing.
you do, then what do you think the employees have, right?
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes even exactly leadership isn't even involved. So from the perspective of the customer now, who's like looking at all this fun kind of product marketing stuff coming out, all this new messaging coming out, what is your thought on whether they get fatigued by how often there is a new release? I mean, for us, Amoeba, we had our biggest release yesterday. We released Pipeline Intelligence powered by Amoeba agents. And then my feed is actually riddled with, I think, another like 15 companies that's just in my network had a release yesterday as well. So when you think about that from the perspective of the buyer, do you feel like they get fatigued by everything that's
I mean, look, until all of our go-to-market teams and all our buyers are just agentic robots talking to each other and selling each other product, we have to understand there's just a normal rate of human absorption.
Yeah.
Especially if I'm doing something the way I do it today, I have to absorb it, and now I should adjust what I'm doing. And yes. And so, I think anything more than a month, faster than a month is ridiculous. At some point, you might move to quarterly, but I think it's a month. And I think is another really interesting thing, which is back to the messaging tree. If you're not changing what you're saying, if you haven't improved the job to be done or doing a new job to be done, what are you announcing?
Yeah.
Right? So, I think some filtering probably helps around the edge.
No, I would agree. There is a lot. There's a lot around like brand refreshes these days as well. But to your point, if you're not fundamentally changing something, what are you essentially launching? Let's talk about something that's been kind of front of mind for me. It's a more future driven, but I have this theory in my head that we'll move from B2B selling to like agent to agent selling, like humans just completely, are like sitting on a beach, like drinking their Mai Tais, get removed out of the equation at some point. They do the mathematician in me is like at some point humans will get out of the way of the math. So do you see that happening at some point where most of the, let's say not all, but most of the buying journey is handled from an agent to an agent? I feel like I've stumped you.
I think it's a long way off.
Long way meaning decades?
5 to 10 years
5 to 10. Okay.
at a minimum. I'm flashing into Ready Player One. I'm just sitting in some like pod somewhere connected up to like some video game and
Yeah.
etc. I'm not going to expect. It's hard for me to look. I think the challenge is, I guess if there's full AGI, sure, but at the end of the day, people make purchase decisions based on make purchase for two reasons: fear or greed.
Yeah.
Fear, somebody else is going to do better than me. Greed, I can do better than somebody else. So until we get there, I think the human to human connection is still very interesting. That's how I think about it.
Do you see humans moving more sort of like up the chain in the
Yes,
sense that
absolutely. I mean, absolutely. There's a thing about how do we think about what does the new software company look like? What's the size of the software company? What happens to junior employees and the rest of it? I think
yeah,
the interesting thing on junior versus senior, we have to think differently. Junior was some people that would come in and they would go do the grunt work because that's how
yeah,
you keep. And then by doing the grunt work repetition, I think the reality is a lot of the grunt work gets automated and goes away.
yeah,
And so I think the reality is that the work that you will be doing is far less automaton work and far more sort of thoughtful work.
yeah. So
I see Julia's come out. We probably got 1 minute left, Julia.
one last question, Julia. One quick question. Now that you talked about kind of teams getting more and more senior, and then the juniors are kind of the grunt work is getting replaced. So what happens to like the teams of the future where the juniors haven't made their way up the ranks in a company?
In my mind, we're in a new age.
Yeah,
And what I look for in a lot of companies is first principles thinkers. When we think of senior, it's somebody who has 10 to 20 years experience, but they have 10 to 20 years of experience in the old way of operating within SaaS.
yeah,
And we're creating a new playbook. And so in my mind, I think less as senior versus junior. I think of, are they first principles thinkers? Are they super smart? Are they super collaborative? Right? Like the best use of AI is how clever are you with a prompt, right? Not understanding, the transformer model. So I get less worried about that. I do think in aggregate, though, we will need less people. So I do believe that there is the number of people that are working in software companies today will be less going forward. So I do believe, interestingly, there is going to probably be some level of retraining and rethinking of the white collar workforce that we didn't do with the blue collar workforce. We went down the NAFTA and globalization route.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brett. This was an interesting chat as always. And
Yeah.
thanks, Julia, for having us.
All right, Tooba, send me all the information on the new release.
I will. Thank you.
Right.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Such a pleasure hosting you. Thank you again, Brett and Tooba. And we are transitioning to our next session. Welcome.
Hey, Nick. Hey, Nick.
Hey, Brett. I agree with everything you just said. So,
All right, we'll see you.
Bye.